You're listening to the Valley Current.
Hey, Steve.
Good evening.
So I should tell you today, there was finally a ruling by the federal district court in New York against those two lawyers who used ChatGPT in a brief, and they had cited a bunch of, or ChatGPT, they say, caused them to cite a bunch of non-existing cases. And surprisingly, the judge only fined them $5,000 each. I thought it was going to be much higher, but the judge did write a 43-page decision that's now published, which pretty much spanks both those lawyers for not doing independent research using, obviously, books or Lexis or Westlaw or other typical tools. And when you read it, it goes over really the fact that judges don't want their time wasted with stuff that's hallucinating. And what's unfortunate, and I read the 43 pages, I sent it to you too, not that you should read it because it's really more about law, and I want to talk about accounting and tax and whether ChatGPT could be helpful in those areas in some ways. But conceptually, when you look at that 43 pages, he never really asked, so what did you type in as the ChatGPT prompt to get these hallucinations? Because there is a theory that I've heard, and I'm starting to believe it's true, that this case that they filed, this personal injury case involving a guy that got hurt or a plaintiff that got hurt, I don't know if it's a guy or a woman, by a cart, a flight attendant's cart that hit their leg and caused them to have a personal injury, that the personal injury occurred so many years ago that it was impossible to even in good faith file a case because the statute of limitations had expired. So I think what they might have done, and I've heard other people say this, is they might say, pretend that you're an expert on statute of limitations and write a story with whatever citations you can muster of why this plaintiff somehow succeeds on this statute of limitations argument, which by all accounts, it looks like there's no way there could ever have been success to begin with. And so they thought they were writing a fictional story in reply because it was set up as almost a fiction from day one, because ChatGPT can write fiction. If you ask it to write fiction, it can write poetry. If you ask it to write poetry. And, they didn't tell the judge that they basically put in kind of a request for a fiction, which made them look even crazier and stupider. But they didn't ask the question, which is, what was the actual prompt? Because it really does look so fictitious. So that's just the opening part of the story here, because judges are pretty much making it clear that they don't want to see a bunch of garbage in, garbage out hit their desk. They just don't have time for it. And they make the assumption, as they're entitled to make under Rule 11 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, that lawyers are being diligent, that they're reading the cases from books or reliable electronic resources, and they're only citing things that are good law, and they're double checking to see if a case has been modified or reversed. These tools are all available. I don't know that people are using books anymore, but years ago we called it shepherdizing the case, which meant using a book to actually look at the case site and whether it had changed in any way. But there are analogies, I think, in the area of tax and accounting that you worry about. But why don't you give me your view about whether you think any of this is going to take hold? Because as you know, people are teaching people how to use ChatGPT, Bard, and other AI tools. And now it's embedded within Microsoft's Bing, so it's readily available at no charge. You can pay for a paid account. Not that that is going to dramatically change things, but what do you think is going to happen in the area of tax and accounting?
Well, Jack, where to begin? Where to approach this?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. I think there was an abdication of responsibility by these lawyers in perhaps in many levels, on many levels. There also is a potential assumption that I would question, that there really is an intelligence inside the artificial intelligence. So a human might have a thought process that, well, I'm being asked to write a fictional work. Whereas if you look under the hood of an artificial intelligence in today's technology, I think there's a good chance that there would just be smoke and mirrors and not an actual thought process. So maybe there was some variable that said, am I being asked to write a fictional or research a factual thesis? And then it got a 60% probability on the fiction and a 40% probability on the factual, and it went with that. But to assume that there was a thought process, in my opinion, gives artificial intelligence too much credit. So I'm going to come out on the downside and say that these things come in waves. And right now, you've got boards of directors running around and panicking and thinking, are we behind on artificial intelligence? Can we catch up? Let's hire some consultants. And then you've got the consultants, like surfers, saying, here comes the next wave. Let's fill all these empty offices in San Francisco with ChatGPT stuff.
Well, I mean, IBM's CEO did come out and say that IBM thinks 20 to 30% of its workforce will be redundant as a result of these tools. That was a pretty ambitious statement, I thought. But the IBM stock took off after he made that announcement, because obviously if you're 20 to 30% less heavy on payroll, that's a big bottom line profitability. And it's sort of like saying a lot of what middle management and lower rung people do is not that creative. It's kind of pushing stuff around. And of course, they've had Watson for many decades now. I mean, Watson has been their AI champion for a long time. It did that game of Jeopardy, or that contest with with the Jeopardy competitor, and won. And we know AlphaGo won against the competition of the Grandmaster of Go. And we know there's lots of stories about how it looks like these machines have real intelligence, but we also know that humans have a level of creativity that is pretty much unmatched across the entire species of creatures and machines that are out there. And we're able to connect things with our minds in unique ways that does create new inventions, new innovations, new insights. And to some degree, the ChatGPT stuff kicks back various texts that might stimulate some new ideas if you really are stuck. But whether it's supposed to write a brief or provide a tax opinion or do an analysis of an accounting spreadsheet and that sort of thing is a whole other kettle of fish. And these guys found out the hard way, albeit not with a big financial sanction, because I thought maybe the judge was going to award all the legal fees that the airline carrier, Avianca, had spent defending what was really a meritless case to begin with, because it was barred by the Warsaw Convention. The statute of limitations under that convention is much shorter than the New York typical personal injury statute of limitations, which is what the fight was about. Because at the same time, the judge today issued an order saying, I'm throwing this case out because you couldn't get over the statute of limitations under the applicable international convention. And that statute of limitations is hard and fast. And there's no law that says otherwise. And the fictitious law you cited obviously it makes things worse. And then I think there was a bit of a cover up in the way the lawyers tried to explain what they did, which only made matters worse, because the judge sensed that instead of just honestly saying we screwed up, this was a huge error, we can't blame ChatGPT, it tells you left, right, and sideways, talk to a lawyer, don't rely on this. I mean, anytime you put a query in, it almost automatically gives you a Miranda type warning. So you really can't blame the tool. You have to blame the operator. And the operator is like trying to blame the tool, and that's just not going to work. I don't even think you can blame Westlaw or Lexis or Casetext or any of the other tools that are out there, because they're just tools and they've got to be used correctly and they've got to be checked and double checked. But I'm curious from a tax point of view, because a lot of people think tax is really well constrained, so that because the tax code is logical and really specific, they seem to think, oh, well, in an area like tax, maybe something like ChatGPT can work because it's kind of like a computer program. The tax code is like a computer program and it's black and white. There's no gray. I mean, you're going to probably take issue with that because you deal with the gray all the time, I would think, right?
Absolutely. The gray areas are our bread and butter, and they are the reason many of our clients come to us. But you're right that there's a calculus as to what is the cost of using ChatGPT and having it mess up, if for no other reason than its claimed excuse that it relies on pre-training with a database dated in 2020, which is now 3 years out of date. And it says, or the version that I have currently says, I can't be relied upon because my training is 3 years out of date. And so I go back to it and say, well, I understand that your sources are limited. Please give me your best guess as to the answer. And it is not willing to take a guess in that situation. So I find it of limited use. And I would add that Google has warned its employees not to enter confidential information in the query to ChatGPT, because the query is not held in confidence and is in fact used for training purposes, and potentially can be visible to other parties or tax authorities. And everything in tax is confidential. So that caution goes tenfold for anything in tax. Any real client situation would have to be redacted and sanitized before it could be a query to ChatGPT. But the consequences for me could be loss of my license to practice. And that consequence is so potentially overwhelming that I'm not ready to use ChatGPT for any significant live purpose at this time.
I mean, what I've been doing, just as you've been talking and I've been listening to you, is I did put a query in just now of a really simple thing, and just to see what kind of Miranda warning would come up. And I'll just put it on my screen and you can see the kind of stuff that I think people are using ChatGPT for, because there are clients that call and say, you know, I used ChatGPT and it gave me this answer, not tax questions. Typically, it's more like contract questions and that sort of thing. So on the screen right now is I just literally, as we talked, said, here's the query, here's the prompt. Taxpayer is preparing his federal income tax return. He is single and trying to understand what is income and what is not income. He has done work for his grandfather, helping him, meaning the grandfather, with various household chores. And his grandfather has paid him $1,000 a month for those services. Is the $12,000 he received from his grandfather taxable income from a federal tax point of view? I thought it was going to give me the Miranda warning, but the Miranda warning comes later. It starts with, from a federal tax point of view, the $12,000 received by the taxpayer for helping his grandfather with household chores would generally be considered taxable income. The IRS defines income as all income from whatever source, blah, blah, blah. 12,000 received by taxpayers considered compensation for services rendered. It would generally be subject to federal income tax. I think this is a gray area where you'd have to talk about gift, and was the grandfather making a gift, right? Because it's a family member. Then he says it's worth knowing that even if the taxpayer did not receive a Form 1099 or other tax reporting, they're still responsible for reporting it on their tax return. It's important to maintain accurate record. You probably would say this is pretty conservative advice, right? But it's giving the advice before at the end it says you should consult with a tax professional or use tax preparation software to accurately report and determine. But what do you think of this answer? Because I just put in a very simple query that probably most people would say, oh, the grandfather's just making a gift, and it's, less than maybe the taxable gift. I forget what the tax is. It 15,000 these days that you can give to a child or a grandchild?
Yeah, it's up to 16,000. And many people would treat that as 100% gift and pay no tax whatsoever.
Right.
And certainly, as a licensed tax professional, you have a duty to your client's best interest to point that out. And if nothing else, to raise the issue of the fair market value of the services. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, the best answer I can think of is that if the person providing the grandchild normally gets paid $10 an hour, and this $1,000 a month translates into $20 an hour, then half of the money received is probably gift, and half would be compensation. But if the grandfather's intent was to make the entire thing a gift, it becomes a much grayer area, and potentially none of the gift would be subject to income tax. However, the grandfather potentially, if he went over $16,000 in a calendar year, then there might be a gift tax filing requirement.
Right. The issue that I remember from law school many decades ago when I took the tax class was that donative intent was the litmus test. What was the grandfather's donative intent? I asked another question. I mean, this is the beauty of ChatGPT. It will throw a lot of stuff back at you pretty quickly. I asked, would the answer change if the grandfather gave over $24,000 and thus over the annual gift tax exclusion, and if the fair market value of the services were only $12,000? So the grandfather is obviously paying double what the fair market value of the services are. And the answer that's coming back, although pretty slowly, if the grandfather gave the taxpayer over $24,000 in a year for household chores, it would be considered a gift and could have potential gift tax implications. The annual gift tax exclusion for 2023, which supposedly they only know to 2021, but now it's saying they know for 2023, is 15,000, but you think the number is actually 16,000, right?
Yeah, it's gone up to 16,000. I'm not sure what the effective date of that increase was. Yeah. But I think that's wrong. I think it's actually giving a wrong exclusion amount.
Yeah, it should be 16. So they got that number wrong. But, maybe you'd say close enough for government work. In this scenario, if the fair market value of the services rendered by the taxpayer is only 12,000 and the grandfather gave over 24, there could be gift tax considerations. The excess amount over the gift tax exclusion is subject to gift tax. That sounds correct. As a recipient of the gift, generally does not have any tax liability for the gift itself. Blah, blah, blah. Grandfather may need to file a gift tax return. It's important to note tax laws can be complex. Again, the Miranda warning. But you can see how for individuals who don't want to pay for a lawyer, a tax lawyer, a tax accountant, a CPA, a licensed tax preparer, it does give you the convenience of typing a few lines in and getting something back that presumably is better than a Google search, right?
Well, we've noticed a couple of errors and omissions, and who is liable for those errors and omissions? Is it the promoter of ChatGPT that can?
There's no liability because they're going to say this is almost like a tool or almost like a game or almost like a entertainment. But, I did ask it to give some citations to the Internal Revenue Code, and it did provide the right, as I recall, the right citation is Section 61 of the Internal Revenue Code on what is gross income, right? That is like where people start in understanding how the tax code works. 61 is pretty broad. Gross income means all income from whatever source derived. And then there's, other stuff that they also cite. I don't know if they got that right or didn't get that right. Section 63 about taxable income, Section 1012, the cost of property, and Section 102 on gift.
I hate to be a devil's advocate here, or maybe I don't hate to be a devil's advocate, but what happens if the answer gets cut off right before the Miranda warning, or the Miranda warning falls off the bottom of the page and is obscured? And then you just have this partial incorrect answer, and you then rely on it. Is there liability?
I don't think so, because I think to sign into ChatGPT, you sign some sort of license agreement of some type that has all sorts of disclaimers in it. So I'm going to ask it to provide the Internal Revenue Code regulations as well, but they give a citation to the IRS Gov website, which I guess is one way to do it. They don't actually provide the regulations. Mixture of licensed data from human trainers, publicly available data. I've not been trained on specific tax regulations. I thought they could provide the actual regulations. They do provide the jump site to irs.gov, so I suppose that's some additional value of some sort. But in general, it doesn't sound like you think that this tool will ever come even close to dealing with what you would say is the common set of problems of the types of clients that you see, or for that matter, the types of clients I see, that usually go far beyond these very basic situations, usually have far more complexity to them. And they're hard to even necessarily write a ChatGPT prompt for. Like in that case that we've been talking about, the Avianca airline case, you'd have to put a prompt in that says there's an international convention that needs to be checked. Like you'd have to put a lot more detail in than just make an argument for why the statute of limitations and provide me with case citations. Like that's going to result in fiction, which is actually what happened that resulted in the judge's 43-page decision and the 7-page ruling dismissing. Interesting, 43-page decision on the sanction, 7-page ruling on the actual case, like a fraction of the number of hours and words was spent throwing the case out. And the judge is required that they tell the client or provide the client with copies of the decisions to make sure they're not hiding from the client just how badly spanked they were. Plus, the judge required that they write letters to the state bar confessing to their sins, and they write letters to the various judges that were misquoted by ChatGPT, so that he's trying to spread the word rapidly, virally. I mean, it's been in the newspaper. I'm sure it'll be in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal tomorrow, because there's really a real spanking that's occurred to these lawyers, these two lawyers who they've gotten a lot of fame, but I think it's negative fame. I don't think it's fame that you would want to get as a lawyer, because it tends
Jack, this is just wonderful. This public humiliation is
I mean, it's you got to imagine that if you're a tax professional, you're saying to yourself, I don't want to be at the risk of what happened with these lawyers if the IRS comes back and says, we think you gave us a bunch of garbage in your letter explaining your client's position, and we're going to take your license away. or we're gonna report you to the state licensing authorities. And it's not probably as bad as a judge, but in some ways it's probably equally bad. And I think this is the message that judge, that federal judge, is trying to convey, which is these tools are arriving very, very quickly. And judges don't want to waste their time, and they don't want opposing lawyers to waste their time. The opposing lawyers figured it out pretty quickly. Like the opposing lawyers said, this is a bunch of bullshit. They must have used AI to generate this. And they said that to the judge. We've looked for these cases. They don't exist. They're fabricated. I mean, I say the interesting part to this story is there are a lot of pro se, that is pro per plaintiffs or pro per parties, defendants, that can't afford lawyers, so they represent themselves. They're going to go to a ChatGPT to help them write stuff, whether with legal authority or without legal authority. They're going to do it. And I don't know if the judges are going to be equally harsh, because the judges are going to say, well, they're not lawyers, and maybe they didn't understand the Miranda warning, or maybe they couldn't afford a lawyer. But it's clear to me that we're not done with the number of instances that will play out across the 50 states, across the 12 or 13 different federal circuit courts of appeal, across the many district courts. I mean, there's 5,000 plus federal judges. There's probably 50,000 plus state court judges, maybe even 500,000. It's a huge number of judges across many, many different courts. They're going to see a lot of this stuff. And this ruling is going to become probably the main precedent that they cite to say, look, you can't do this without having sanctions follow. And so it's going to teach a really important lesson.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this episode of The Valley Current.